This is the RPG Crawler, and welcome back to my look at the various versions of Dungeons & Dragons. Last time, we took a look at the late 70s and the advanced Dungeons & Dragons system itself, which had focused on providing a clear and thorough set of rules that could allow games to be run more consistently between groups, as well as cover more diverse situations in-game. A few years after the release of Advanced Dungeons & Dragons, however, a new revision of the basic Dungeons & Dragons set, previously edited and recompiled by Holmes, was crafted. Not as an introduction to AD&D as the first set had been, but as a continuation of Dungeons & Dragons as its own game. There were a few reasons for this. One of them was that the basic Dungeons & Dragons system was still selling well. In fact, it took a while for AD&D to surpass it. Another was the basic difference in the philosophy of the two games, with AD&D supposedly focusing on a more exacting and tournament-ready rule set, while D&D was presumed to be more house rule friendly. But perhaps more tellingly, at the time that the Basic and Expert sets were revised and authored by Tom Moldvay and David Cook, legal battles regarding whether AD&D was in fact a derivative of D&D or a different game were currently raging. In an attempt to bolster the idea that AD&D was its own separate, incompatible product, further development of D&D could show that it was its own product line by itself. Regardless of the reasons why they came to pass, the Moldvay-Cook Basic and Expert sets, or BX-D&D as it's sometimes known nowadays, was actually a solid, standalone system designed to take characters into the middling teens, and has adherence all the way to this day, either through the original version or through various retro clones. Oddly enough, it would be revised again into the BECMI version just 2 years later, which had rules changes substantial enough to merit consideration as its own version. So the window for the BX version remains one of the shortest in terms of Dungeons & Dragons releases to this day. Tom Moldvay, an editor at TSR and author or co-author of several critically important modules in the early history of D&D, and who was an avid player of the game even before being hired on, was tapped to author the basic set. Similar to the Holmes edition from a few years prior, it would take parties from 1st to 3rd level. However, instead of recommending the AD&D game to follow it, it then led to the Expert set. David Zeb Cook, who would go on to be lead designer of AD&D's 2nd edition much later on, wrote the Expert set. Interestingly enough, the basic set does mention a companion set for higher level play than even the Expert set provided at the time, but this would not actually happen until the later BECMI revision. Even as truncated as it was, the range of levels given in the Basic and Expert sets for this particular version allows for some considerable amount of playtime, and the fact that both were released in the same year meant that a group could purchase the rules and be pretty set for possibly years to come. This has probably contributed to the surprising impact this revision had for how short a time it was out. So let's take a look at each set. Physically, the basic set had art by Errol Otis, and contained a single rulebook, a copy of B2, Keep on the Borderlands, and a set of polyhedral dice. This is where the classic red bordered to designate the basic rules started, although in this case it was only on the rulebook itself. While it was a re-edit of the prior Holmes edition, substantial changes were made in not only the layout, but in the writing and the rules themselves. The rulebook itself had holes appropriate to keep the pages in a 3-ring binder, and they were prefixed with the label B on each page. I guess the intent was to allow the various rulebooks to be combined with later contents into one massive binder, such as the Expert set and so forth. This is mostly noteworthy because a similar tactic was later used in the 2nd edition Monstrous Compendium series for AD&D. The basic rulebook starts with an introduction that familiarizes the reader with the concept of RPGs in general, an overview of the book beyond, simple definitions of common terms, as well as a quick guideline on the use of dice. This is followed by a brief chapter on character creation. A couple things to note on this particular version are the use of the basic 3d6 to generate the 6 classic ability scores, but also the existence of a system wherein you can trade ability scores, at a character creation at least, to boost your prime requisite on a 2-for-1 basis, at least within certain limits. This optional rule never really made it into the core AD&D game, but it was used in both the BX and the later BECMI versions. Ability score bonuses are pretty much all standardized to the same curve, with penalties and bonuses for the various abilities ranging from -3 to +3, and all ability scores using the same cutoff points for where each bonus and penalty begins and ends. The only real odd one out is Charisma, which softens the bonuses from -2 to +2 and includes additional limits on retainers and morale. The basic set gives rules for characters to advance to level 3, although with a massive difference in experience requirements between the various classes, some classes will be needing to go to the expert rule set long before others do. This set follows the tradition of the Holmes set in dividing halflings, dwarves, and elves into their own classes. As far as the class specifics go, it should be noted that clerics don't get spells in this edition until 2nd level, and thieves use a flat percentage for skills without any real ability to customize them. Alignment has gone back to the single-axis law chaos spread, although the concept of alignment languages is actually retained for what it's worth. Basic equipment is given, along with associated costs, but individual weapons under the basic rules do not use different damage dice. Different damage dice, as appears in AD&D, is called variable weapon damage and is just an optional rule given later on in the rules. After the equipment section, there's a list of basic spells, mostly first-level cleric and magic user spells, with some second-level magic user spells within there. There's only the most basic of spells, 8 level 1 cleric spells, and 12 each of level 1 and 2 magic user spells, and they utilize the stripped-down format of simply a descriptive paragraph, range, and duration where necessary. Interestingly, after this is a short section where very few second-level cleric spells and third-level magic user spells could be found, mostly for when you're creating higher-level NPCs or when you're distributing scrolls as loot. Following this is a section on adventuring, which includes the usual subsystems like movement, lighting, encumbrance, opening doors, etc., but also gives guidelines on forming and balancing a party, using retainers, handling traps, and wandering monsters. It concludes with the guidelines on awarding experience, which, as usual thus far, is given both for monsters defeated and gold recovered. There's no training requirements or the like built into this basic version of D&D, so at least that much is good. The encounter steps are simplified, using a d6 for initiative, checking for surprise, and randomized monster reactions. Combat is done in phases, including optional morale rules, then movement, then missile fire, then magic, and finally melee in turn. Attack rolls are handled similarly to contemporaneous versions, with a d20 roll versus a target number, based on the character's level and the target's armor class. Natural healing is actually a little bit more generous than the equivalent AD&D one, giving back a random number between 1 and 3 hit points per day of rest rather than simply 1. Although there is no listed optional negative hit point rule, so dying is a little bit easier. Other typically basic rules like thrown weapons and poison are covered, and saving throws are similar to how they were in AD&D, with the now seemingly classic categories of death ray or poison, magic wands, paralysis or turn to stone, dragon breath, and rods, staffs, or spells. Yes, the categories were a little bit shuffled up, but they're still quite recognizable as the ones that you'd see in AD&D and then later 2nd edition. Following this section on combat is the section on monsters, and this includes not only descriptions of common monster abilities, but also a list of level-appropriate monsters, including many classics. Now, a few of these are arguably a little less level-appropriate than others, but I suppose it's a good way to teach a low-level party caution. The monsters in the monster section are often listed with a treasure type, which is a concept found in AD&D, and the next section includes those treasure tables for random treasure generation. This can be for anything from individual pocket change to massive dragon hordes. Basic magic item lists are included in the treasure section, although some of the more powerful items, weapons, armor, etc. are left out. Magic weapons, for instance, tend to top out about +2 in basic rules, with some +3s against specific types of creatures. Other types of magic items have only several items listed each, making for a relatively short but pretty utilitarian list. Part 8 includes a nice, almost menu-style list of elements of adventures, so new dungeon masters can use them as guidelines and outlines for creating their own. These include some random tables to cover stocking the dungeon, generating NPC parties, wandering monster tables, etc. It also includes a small sample dungeon, an example of how that sample dungeon was stocked, as well as how it was run. There's also some more DM tips and an example of play. The basic rules pretty much conclude after that with a glossary and a list of inspirational reading material similar to Appendix N in the AD&D game. This list, however, includes a lot more young adult reading suitable for the target audience of basic D&D at the time. Now, the Expert set came out in a blue box, similar to the basic set, and included the Expert rulebook, some more dice, and the adventure X1, The Isle of Dread, which is now roundly considered a classic. Once again, the box art was by Errol Otis. Like the basic rulebook, the Expert set had holes suitable for use in a binder, and its page numbers were prefixed with the X. Now, once again, this was presumably to allow it and the basic set to be contained in the same binder. The booklet is 64 pages and honestly much more fleshed out additional rules for higher level characters. Indeed, the basic set was required because it did not include just the basic discussion of those rules, simply referencing back to them when they needed to be expanded on. The introduction states that the Expert rules were to allow characters to reach level 14, and mentioned inclusion of wilderness campaign rules to allow characters to do more than simply wander a dungeon kicking down doors. In lieu of character creation rules, there's some talk of mixing high and low level characters and when this should be avoided, and a quick overview of the optional and core rules included in the Expert set. Part 2 includes experience tables for all character classes up to level 14, or their lower maximums in the case of demi-humans, as well as relevant skill and ability tables, such as how many spells spellcasters can get per level, and thief skills. Information on higher level strongholds is given, as well as guidelines for leveling characters all the way up to level 36, although those are only very rough guidelines. The companion rules are once again mentioned, although that set, as I said, wouldn't actually be brought out under this particular revision. A slightly expanded list of equipment is given, including vehicles as well as actual descriptions of what certain items on the list are, which is actually a very useful thing that a lot of early rule sets tended to gloss over. The next chapter covers magic, including rules for replacement spellbooks, and then gives descriptions of a fair number of spells for cleric and magic users, covering up to level 5 for each one. Cleric spells generally include 8 spells for each level, at least for 1 and 2, and then 6 spells for levels 3 to 5, while magic user and elf spells include 12 spells for each level all the way through. With as few spells as that seems to include, most of the classics of the time are in there, and even the few 5th level spells there are pretty powerful, all things considered. Once again, there's a part that details adventuring, which starts with organizing the party, and this time there's some indication of considerations for overland travel. It then goes on to cover mapping and movement, including travel over outdoor terrain, water, and through the air. Guidelines are given for hiring specialists and mercenaries, presumably for when the characters build their strongholds, and then there's an expanded experience table given for high-end monsters. The encounter rules from the basic set are restated, this time with a little bit more clarity, although actual combat rules are just left referenced to the basic set. Expanded saving throw tables are given, as well as more variable weapon damage rules for some new included weapons that were only in this set. There's some basic rules for aerial combat as well. The monster section of the Expert rules is much the same as that in the basic set, except that it covers higher-end threats in general. Likewise, the treasure section is simply an expanded treasure list, including higher-end magic items to award to the players, as well as more detailed treasure tables that include these higher-end items. The Dungeon Master section covers handling actions not covered in the rules, researching magic spells, and producing magical items, as well as a very basic rule set for constructing strongholds. The rules for creating a scenario are restated, with some tables expanded to cover higher-end content, but a section on designing a wilderness area is specifically included as well. There are rules for becoming lost during wilderness exploration, encountering random castles and settlements while wandering in the wilds, and then some additional DM tips to cover issues that may come up in higher-end play. Finally, for that section, the Grand Duchy of Karamikos makes an appearance as an example wilderness map. A section on special adventures follows, including waterborne rules and ship-to-ship combat. The expert set then concludes with a basic index and glossary of terms not covered in the basic set. So I'm not going into details over the included adventures, but I will say that both B2, Keep on the Borderlands, and X1, The Isle of Dread, are classics, and well worth looking into for the archetypal old-school adventure feel. So from a rules standpoint, the basic and expert sets of this era are actually pretty much covering the vast majority of what a character may want to do during your typical campaign. And despite not having the companion set until the later rewrite and revision, it ends up being a very, very complete system. The simplified nature of the BX system ends up running a little bit faster in practice than the AD&D system, at least in my experience. And the more generalized nature of a lot of the rules means that it's actually sometimes a lot easier to come up with rulings on the fly that seem fair. Sure, it lacks the complexity of the AD&D game, but honestly, that can be a benefit for certain types of campaigns. And the lack of extremely high-level play found in the later Beckme/Menser revision tends to limit the scope of a campaign to a classic medieval fantasy sword and sorcery type feel. This has resulted in a surprising longevity of this particular revision itself, as well as popularity that just goes beyond the basic number, the very small number of years that it actually was out. It's one of the more commonly cloned versions among the retro clones, and many groups play this particular revision to this day. All of this from a revision that was thought to be rushed out for legal purposes, which lasted only 2 years before another major rewrite. My personal experience with the Moldvay Cook version is admittedly limited to retro-style play. I didn't actually get into it at the time because I was a little bit too young. However, having looked at it from a system point of view and having played it in recent years, quite a lot actually, I can definitely see why some people prefer it even over the later Beckme revision. And that one I will cover in the next video. For now, this has been the RPG Crawler with my D&D Retrospective. If you like what you've seen, remember to leave a like, comment if you've got feedback, and subscribe for more RPG content. Until next time, take care and goodbye.